there, Internet. And how are you? You doing well? I hope that this live stream receives your attention if you're watching it. Um, the world has now seen more than 40 days or so of war between Israel and the Hamas. And of course, those who uh, don't take Israel's side will say no, it's a war between Israel and Palestinians, forgetting, of course, the fact that the Hamas, so to speak, poked the bear, right, and brought this attack onto Gaza, whether they like to admit it or not. And those who will say that it's not proportional, I say, since when is war about proportion? War is about, as General Patton said, the purpose of war is not to die for your country, it's to make the other schmuck die for his. Well, he said it in different words, but it's to make the other bastard die for his words. And war is terrible, obviously. And one of the worst parts of war is when war is prolonged unnecessarily and more people die than necessarily need to. And, nobody should have to die, obviously, through violence. And war is terrible because it's all about violence. But you have to remember, what are the root causes of the war, so to speak? And if we go back to just October 7th, it's pretty clear what that root cause was. Hamas attacked Israel, and Israel has responded in kind. And the fact that Israel has killed more Palestinians than Palestinians killed Israelis and people in Israel does not mean that the Hamas side was justified in doing what they did. They were clearly unjustified in doing what they did. And Israel, according to the laws of war, which is crazy to think that those exist, but they do, and that's a good thing that they do exist, because it limits the amount of barbarism by any side that obeys the laws of war, as Israel does, whether you believe that or not. They do. Israel's response has not been out of limits of the laws of war. If you believe that they do not target innocent civilians. Some people will say, well, they do target innocent civilians. Well, you would need to show evidence of that. So far, the evidence that we see is that they target the terrorists who launched this war, and those terrorists are very often hiding behind human shields, or they were until recently, and they may still be in some places, but at least for most of North Gaza, the northern half of Gaza, most of the civilians have, according to the UN and the Hamas and Israel, most of them have evacuated to the southern half of Gaza, which means that clearly the civilian casualty rate in Gaza is likely to have already started dropping off precipitously, and that is a good thing. And hopefully it will completely stop, and that would be good. But nevertheless, it is the Hamas who have been hiding behind civilians, and in an ongoing war, hiding behind civilians is a war crime. Firing from behind civilians is another war crime. Discriminately towards civilians on the other side is another war crime. So the Hamas are committing 3 war crimes every time they launch an attack, pretty much, right? Um, at least. That's not even to mention the fact that they have kidnapped people from Israel, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Christians, whatever, international people, and that is another war crime. And then you hear from the Palestinians, well, Israel has been committing a war crime against the Palestinians in Gaza and in general, but specifically in Gaza for 75 years. And they've been committing a genocide against the Palestinians of Gaza for 75 years. So, first of all, any rational person who knows anything about history will know that Israel has not been occupying Gaza for 75 years. Even if you believe the argument that Israel currently occupies, or did until October 7th, 2023, and from 2005 when they withdrew, even if you believe that argument, that Israel was still occupying Gaza at that time, it's very clear that Israel was not occupying Gaza from at least 1948 to 1967. Because it was the Egyptians who occupied Gaza at that time. Right? And they didn't consider it to be an occupation. They just considered it to be Egypt. And when Egypt lost Gaza to to Israel during the Six-Day War of 1967, they relinquished control and never demanded it back. And when they were offered it back multiple times by Israel, they refused each and every time. Which brings us to the next question. Well, even before we get there, if Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians, then why were there 2 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza some 30, 40 years ago, and now there are over 5 million? Why were there just 1 million, apparently, just about 1 million or so Palestinians in Gaza in 2005 when the Israelis left, and now there are more than 2 million in the Gaza Strip? How can that be called a genocide? By what measure is a genocide if your population is increasing in the very lands where you claim there's a genocide happening? And it's not just increasing, it's doubling in 15 years, right? So, are there atrocities happening? Yes, that's what war is. Was this war provoked by atrocities launched by Hamas? Yes, absolutely. Has Hamas been engaged in indiscriminate attacks on Israeli populations or populations in Israel for more than 20 years, even before they took control of Gaza? Yes. Yes, they did. People seem to forget that one of the reasons Israel withdrew from Gaza is because Ariel Sharon made the calculation that one of the only ways that seemed logical to slow down or stop the rocket attacks that were being launched daily from around 2000 until 2005 from Gaza into Israel was to withdraw, to disengage unilaterally from the Gaza Strip and hand over full control to the Palestinian people. And that is exactly what happened. Now, why it happened is all obviously political reasons. And there were many people who were obviously against it. Many people obviously supported it. And it was a very difficult action for Israel to take. They physically removed over 8,000 settlers from all of their settlements And they also took every single dead body that was buried in the ground that was Jewish, so as not to leave any Jewish soul in Gaza, because they knew exactly what would happen if they did leave any dead bodies behind, that they would be desecrated by the very people that were going to take over. And that is pretty much exactly what happened. They didn't desecrate any, there were none to desecrate, but they desecrated every synagogue. They destroyed every settlement that Israel had built. They destroyed every greenhouse and other thing that the Israelis left behind, which they could have used. They could have had whole settlements, right, capable of housing thousands of families in very nice homes, relatively to what they have in lots of parts of Gaza. And they could have had agricultural infrastructure, industrial infrastructure. There were a bunch of factories there. They could have used those factories for good, for economic purposes, to grow their country's economy, their nation, or whatever you want to call it, whatever they have in the strip. But what did they choose to do instead? They chose to destroy, and they chose to take the copper from the pipes and use those for weapons, and they chose to take everything left over from the greenhouses and use it for building arms. And they chose to destroy every house and not rebuild a thing. You can still look today on satellite pictures and see every single settlement that was built has been destroyed, and not a single thing has been built in its place. Not one thing. They're just left as monuments of destruction, right? And that is very telling of the kind of people that run the place since 2005. And of course, Hamas took over in 2007 after winning an election in 2006, not by an overwhelming majority. In fact, they didn't even get 50% of the vote. They got around 44% of the vote. This sparked a civil war between them and Fatah, because Fatah had declared that it was not a legitimate election, because they didn't get 50% of the vote. And the Palestinians were once again sold down the river by their own leaders in the Hamas and in the Fatah, because on the one hand, the obviously corrupt Fatah, was not fulfilling its promise to turn Gaza into a prosperous land. They were focused once again on death and destruction. At the same time, Hamas was promising even more death and destruction, with the key difference being that they would claim that they were less corrupt or not corrupt compared to Fatah. Well, that has proven to be a complete lie, since obviously Hamas is extremely corrupt, just like Fatah, and their leaders have squirreled away billions of dollars of aid in order to escape Gaza and enrich themselves and live a life of luxury in places like Qatar and Turkey and wherever else they are. So it's utter hypocrisy and a bald-faced lie to suggest that the Hamas is somehow less corrupt than Fatah. It's just the facts bear themselves out. Of course, people who don't know this, people who are ignorant, fall prey to the entire ploy. And that ploy, unfortunately, manifests itself because hatred markets ignorance. What do I mean by that? That's the nut of this entire video. Hatred markets ignorance to no end. Hatred uses ignorance as a tool, as a weapon of misinformation and disinformation in order to advance its own agenda. And anybody who knows the history of what has been happening in Israel and with the Palestinian Arabs since before there was a state of Israel knows that the hatred stemmed from one side. Without question, it started when more than 100 years ago, Jews started to re-enter the land of Israel, which was then called the British Mandate of Palestine. Keyword British Mandate of Palestine. It was not a nation called Palestine. It has never been a nation or a state called Palestine. There were no people who called themselves, Palestinians in the same way that they do today. And yes, there were Jews and Muslims and Christians and Circassians and Druze and other people living in that land, in the land of the British Mandate of Palestine, who were calling themselves, who had quote-unquote Palestinian passports. Again, those were British Mandate of Palestine passports. They were not Palestinian passports. And while people will go ahead and quote Golda Meir, the former Prime Minister of Israel, as saying herself that she was a Palestinian from 1921 until 1948 because she had a Palestinian passport, what she unfortunately did not add to her quote was that she was a British Mandate of Palestine citizen or subject from 1921 to 1948. She was not a Palestinian per se. And people may shorthand it and they may say, well, they were just Palestinians. No, they were not. And there was no such thing as a Palestinian movement for an independent state of Palestine until at least 1964, when Yasser Arafat proposed the idea that there should be a separate state called Palestine for the Arabs, mostly Muslims, as well as some Christians, to be called Palestine. And that was the birth of the PLO. And anybody who fails to recognize that simply does not know their history. And so that leaves us in a world where we have sides with reasons for their warring behavior from time to time. And among those sides is at least one side that is swamped in their own dark age and ignorance of historical facts. Partly because they've been extremely miseducated and they've been misinformed. And if they live in the areas of Judea, Samaria, known as the West Bank of the River Jordan, or Gaza, those particular people have been bred and indoctrinated from practically birth to hate and to want to kill Jews and Israelis and Jews around the world. It's literally in their preschool education curriculum. And it goes on all the way through their advanced educational degrees. And they literally use examples in 6th grade textbooks of, for physics classes or introductory physics classes, things like, ballistics of a missile or a slingshot to kill Jews, right, in their educational material. There's no shortage of examples of where they use hate in their education. So, when I say that hate markets ignorance, I mean that to the fullest extent. There's no shortage of hate. there's no shortage of ignorance, and the marketing done towards the people who are ignorant is boundless, apparently. If you consider also the fact that from 1948 until 1967, no Palestinian state was created, even though there was plenty of land for them to do it in, and it was under the control of Arab nations, namely Egypt and Jordan. And yet they did not create a Palestinian state. And if you look at the original map of what was the British Mandate of Palestine, you'll see that it included not only all of what is now the land of Israel, of the state of Israel, but it also included all of what was then known as Transjordan, which became later known as Jordan. And people will say, well, of course they weren't going to divide that land between Arabs and Jews, since there were no Jews living there. True. That is very true. And yet, if you look at the landmass size of that land, the overwhelming majority of that land is in what is today Jordan. And only the land west of the river bank of the Jordan River, which is known today by many people as the West Bank, and is known, or is called by others as the original or older names that it had, which were Judea and Samaria. Giving that land to Arabs was a way to show them that the West was being accommodating to their demands, and because also it was taking into account the fact that many Arabs from Syria and from Saudi Arabia and even from places like Yemen, but notably Syria, Transjordan, Saudi Arabia, had made their way into British Mandate Palestine in order to work for the British during the period of 1921 to 1948. They went there as mercenaries, they went there as merchants, they went there as ordinary people looking to live in a state that was run, and it wasn't a state, they live in a territory that was under the rule of the British Empire, because they figured doing so would be better for their economic well-being. And so they went. And many, many, many of those people who claim to be Palestinians now claim their roots are ancient in the land, when in fact their own ancestors only appeared in the land at around the same time as the Jews who were returning to the land. In many cases, they came well after. So, they came between 1921 and 1948. There were already plenty of Jewish people who had returned to the land in that time, because Zionism was established in the late 1890s, 1896 or so, by Theodor Herzl. And bear in mind, there were already Jews living in what is now Israel, at that time. There have been Jews living non-stop in what is Israel today for more than 3,000 years. Like Jerusalem itself is 3,000 years old. So, and it goes back to, the presence of Jews in Israel goes back arguably, at least 3,500 years or so, when you consider that Jerusalem is 3,000 years old. It was not, Jerusalem was not immediately made the capital of Israel, right? There were many other cities first, or before, which were the places where the Jewish leaders were living until it became the capital of Israel. And there were Jews living in Judea, there were Jews living in Samaria, right? So the history of the Jews in that land goes back well beyond the existence of Islam, let alone any so-called Palestinian people. But of course, it's not to say that there isn't a lot of commonality through relationships and everything else between the two people. So ultimately, this is a stupid war like any other, and it should end. But it should be ended when one side is victorious over another, and hopefully that will be the Israeli side, because the Israeli goal is to achieve peace with its neighbors, whereas the Palestinian goal is to eradicate, actually commit real genocide against the Jewish people. Anyway, that's it for now. I'll continue more later.